We took an emotional look in the last video at what makes a story feel artificial and unsatisfying, but what are the criteria for remedying this? What makes the events of a story feel satisfying? During the incredibly stupid Viceroy Bubbles von Salamancer intermission, Hussey goes on at length about this. You look at all these skeletons and think to yourself, this is probably going to be really important later on, because that's what happens in adventures. A thing happens, then you forget about that thing for a while, but it turns out to be important down the road. Like, some heroes will be fighting a bad guy, and things will look bleak for them, but then out of nowhere this skeleton army will arrive as reinforcements or something, thus turning the tide of battle. Then you go, aha! So that's why this little salamander summoned those skeletons. Everything makes sense now, and in retrospect is elegant in its simplicity. Despite being framed as a cheap parlor trick here, this type of thing can be really important to engaging readers in a story. Humans are problem solvers by nature, and there's something evolutionarily wired deep into our psyche that makes the revelation of things clicking into place feel deeply satisfying. For a case in point, just think back to your feelings you had when you finally saw the bunny inside the green box. For me, that was one of the most intensely gratifying moments I've ever experienced within any story. That said, it would make sense if the complement of rage is one of the most powerful aspects around if wielded properly. As I said before, I think that this complement is hope, and where rage describes plot contrivance, hope describes plot coherence, and it's named after what the readers of the story hold on to when waiting for these kinds of revelations to come, and prove that the effort that they took to get there was worth it. Fortunately, we're in a unique position to evaluate these aspects, since 4 out of the 5 hope or rage players are either bards or princes, which are the only 2 classes that we're given explicit definitions for. In fact, we're given 2 subtly different definitions for each one. Callie defines the bard class as either one who allows X to be destroyed, or one who invites destruction through X. I think that our evaluation of Gamzee very clearly shows us that he fits this latter definition. He's responsible for Caliborn, and he accomplishes this through plot holes and utter bullshit. And where Gamzee so nicely fits the latter definition, our other bard just as easily fits the former. Cronus is the bard of hope, and where Gamzee can be thought of as someone who invites destruction through plot contrivance, Cronus can be thought of as someone who allows plot coherence to be destroyed. Cronus is responsible for, in my opinion, the single biggest plot hole in the entire story. Arania tells us that Cronus was attacked by a powerful magician from afar at a very young age, but somehow had the spell deflected, leaving him sealed away in a collection of vessels. From the angels prophesizing his arrival, to his name being a reference to the Titan of Greek mythology who usurped the position of his father who had dominion over time, to the implication that he's the first in a chain of hope players prophesized to defeat him, this magician is so obviously Lord English that if you have a problem with me proceeding under that assumption, then I have a problem with you. But then, when the hell could this have happened? What are these vessels? They're plural, so it can't be Lil Cal, can it? Why and how was the spell deflected? Where was Lord English when this happened? This story is so thoroughly disconnected and irreconcilable with everything else we know that it's baffling why this would even be in the story at all. Cronus himself could have easily explained all of this to us, but he didn't. He was too busy flirting with anything that moved and trying to cultivate his self-image to be concerned with tying loose plot threads together. As a passive player, he doesn't open up this plot hole himself. Someone else does. All he has to do is fulfill his role and not bother to close it. We are all very lucky that we didn't see more of Cronus. It's been implied that a character's class has as much of an impact on their character arcs as their aspect, and it seems like all of the bards and princes we see have to fight against being destroyed by their own aspect while learning to wield it. We talked about how this could be applied to Gamzee in the last video, and while we haven't gotten to Hart yet, you can imagine how this interpretation would apply to Dirk very naturally. To see the most drastic case of this in action, however, we need to look at Eredin. Callie defines the prince class as either one who destroys his aspect, or one who causes destruction through their aspect. And while Eredin definitely does wreak some havoc through his hope wand, he falls into the former definition in basically every other respect imaginable. Eredin's character arc is, similarly to the other bards and princes, a self-destructive downward spiral, with his ending in the tragic and rage-induced murder of all of those closest to him. This all stems from the destruction of his own hope. Hope that he can forge meaningful romantic relationships with those around him, hope that their situation hiding on the meteor could possibly end with anything other than their deaths, and, perhaps most interestingly for our purposes, hope that the plot was cohesive in all the ways that he wanted and needed it to be. One of the consequences of reading a story serially, that is, in a slow trickle as it's being produced, is that you have lots of time to develop and become extremely invested in your own interpretations. This is dangerous because when said interpretation is shown to be wrong, it's extremely hard to admit, since doing so would require you to completely reevaluate the story up until that point. This leaves you with a bit of a dilemma. Either you can do what I just said, or you can do the more common thing, claim that the author is a hack, that the story's gone to shit, and simply stop reading it. In either case, the response will probably be pretty emotional, and we can all probably confirm this by recalling the one or two instances in which we've done this to ourselves. I think that a very large number of those who have given up on Homestuck over the years have done so entirely as a result of this, and in the case of Eredin, this is presented as his tragic flaw. In everything he did, he had a tendency to overcommit and overemphasize. He was absolutely committed to the notion that magic was fake and everything could be explained with science. This resulted in him no doubt feeling a little bit disenfranchised and humiliated as he was chainsawed in half by a magic vampire who had come back from the dead. He blew every relationship he had out of proportion and ended up pushing those closest to him away as a result, and he even overcommitted to coming off as a nautically themed supervillain and instead just ended up looking like kind of a tool. In all these ways, Eredin was destroyed by hope, while being simultaneously, tragically, and somewhat paradoxically the one responsible for said destruction in the first place. He destroyed some hope for his teammates by blowing up the Matriorb, sure, but the truly impactful way that Eredin fulfilled his role as the Prince of Hope was by destroying hope for himself. For the sake of completeness, we can also view Cronus and Kurlaz as players who were destroyed by their own aspects. Cronus was pretty much the same case as Eredin, but in reverse, described as someone who was committed to the importance of magic in the story and believing himself to be destined for wizardry. This never happened, though, resulting in a gradual loss of faith in the story over time and being at least somewhat responsible for the repulsive personality we observe when we meet him. Of course, we as readers know that magic is real as shit in Homestuck, and that Cronus' gradual downfall was probably his own fault by not looking hard enough to find it. Kurlaz, the Prince of Rage, was apparently a rather enjoyable person until having a nightmare so terrifying that he woke up screaming loud enough to permanently deafen Meulin, who was with him at the time. Orania mentions that this scream echoed the horror of the vast honk itself, so it might stand to reason that what Kurlaz was reacting to was Lord English's arrival. In any case, Kurlaz took on a permanent vow of silence after this, and completely changed as a character into someone that seemed pretty much unanimously hated by everyone except for Meulin. In this way, he might just be the most obvious and literal case of someone destroyed by their aspect out of any of the bards or princes. With our examination of Eredin, we've already started looking at what Hope and Rage describe besides coherence and contrivance, so let's summarize that. Many have related Rage to negative emotions, and I mostly agree with that. I think that Hope and Rage describe positive and negative outlooks, respectively. I say this to make a distinction between what Hope and Rage describe and what Life and Doom describe, in much the same way that I distributed the ideas pertaining to freedom between life and breath. When I say outlooks, I'm referring to a general attitude on the present situation, whereas I'll argue later that Life and Doom describe the raw positive and negative emotions which can come in response to that outlook. Most importantly, though, I think that Hope and Rage describe all the ideas pertaining to belief and the power of it. For starters, let's look again at Kurlaz. Kurlaz is shown to have the power to manipulate the beliefs of Meulin, temporarily turning her into a fanatical believer in his clan religion. Being only temporary hypnotism, it's hard to think of Kurlaz as someone who destroys the beliefs of others exactly, but we might be able to find a connection by looking at who exactly he's able to manipulate besides her. In addition to Meulin, who Kurlaz himself permanently deafened, it's implied that he might be able to manipulate Mituna, who gave himself permanent brain damage by overexerting himself. Not only that, Orania mentions that the only thing she knows about the incident is that Kurlaz was probably with him at the time. It stands to reason from this that Kurlaz probably had something to do with Mituna's brain damage, and if that's true, then the only characters we know of him manipulating are those which he himself has had a hand in destroying, at least in some sense of the word. An interesting thought, but let's get back on topic. Throughout all of Homestuck, by far one of the most repeated phrases is, "Believing in X makes it slightly less fake," and I believe that this is at the heart of what these two aspects, especially hope, are all about. We can already see the complement of this with Gamzee. His lack of belief made the story even more fake, allowing him to get away with all manner of bullshit. But to look at this more directly, let's finally turn to Jake. Jake English is the Page of Hope. The Page class is definitely one of the more perplexing ones in Homestuck, and a few have already asked me for my take on it. So before we actually get started talking about Jake, allow me to offer up my interpretation there. Disclaimer, this is my own personal interpretation, and as such I won't be basing any further inferences off of it. If you don't like this interpretation, rest assured that it won't have any bearing on the rest of this analysis series, and the same goes for my interpretations of all the other classes. I'm fairly committed to keeping all of my guesses and inferences one logical step away or less from the actual source material, in the name of keeping what I'm doing in this series something which I can comfortably call analysis and not theory crafting. Anyway, pages by the standard definition of the word are knights in training. My guess is that pages and knights are the two fighter classes, with the distinction being as follows. If you've ever played a MOBA game like Dota or League of Legends, then you're probably familiar with the concept of a carry. Playing a carry involves picking a character which is borderline useless early on in the game, but with the proper equipment and experience becomes a force to be reckoned with later on. These games frequently revolve around the rest of the team making space for the carry, that is, starting fights, taking smaller objectives, and otherwise distracting the enemy team so that the carry can do his or her own thing undisturbed. The carry will frequently ignore major fights entirely, focusing instead on making money and leveling up, and typically won't get involved at all until its later stages. Compare this to Jake's tendency to go off on his own and be, as he calls it, a bit of a solo act. And if things go too bad early on or the game ends too quickly, then the carry might never even get to have their time in the spotlight, see Tavros in the Troll session. To make sure that a team makes it to the late game, someone will usually pick another character who's useful earlier in order to lead the charge and compensate while they wait for their carry to be ready. These characters peak early and often have skills that make them more team-focused, and in my mind these are akin to the Knights. Both Dave and Karkat back up my argument here. Both have skill sets which allow them to be extremely useful early. Dave's powers peak early enough to carry his team through the whole reckoning, getting weeks worth of work done in a matter of hours, and it's hard to say what powers he really even gains by reaching the god tiers. Karkat also peaks extremely early. His skills and focus with respect to managing his team were said to have been the sole reason why they didn't just all end up killing each other, but his abilities, specifically his combat prowess, peak so early that he doesn't even feel useful by the end of the story. By the logic that the page needs to focus on themselves for the majority of the game and the knights work towards the survival of the group, my guess would be that the page is the active class and the knight is the passive. With all that said, we can see as early as Jake's introduction page how much potential he has in more ways than one. In fact, our expectations are high even before that. This kid was a near legendary figure pre-Scratch. The ultimate badass, renowned adventurer, inventor, and billionaire. This kid is unquestionably going to be unbelievably awesome. The only question is whether or not he'll overshadow literally everyone or just mostly everyone. We as readers aren't even the only ones thinking this. Everyone around Jake is absolutely infatuated with him from the beginning through most of the rest of Act 6. And upon actually seeing him, our hopes go soaring even higher. Jake at first comes off like he was explicitly designed to tie as many loose ends together as possible. Everything from his name to his shirt to his computers to his obsession with skulls screams that this kid is going to be absolutely essential to Lord English's backstory. Shit, he probably is Lord English. Beyond that, everything else we see pertaining to him, from the scattered pumpkins to the bunny on the table to the monsters depicted on his bed, yells just as loudly that this kid is the key to it all. Whether or not any of this is actually true, from the standpoint of plot coherence, the potential is there, and boy is there a lot of it. Getting only slightly less meta, Jake himself has the potential to understand effective storytelling better than anyone else by virtue of him having watched seemingly every movie in existence. However, his taste in movies is completely indiscriminate, meaning it would take a long time and a lot of effort to develop some analytical skills and become a true movie aficionado. The same exact thing can be said of his belief system. It's shown in multiple ways that Jake has the power to make any belief he has into a reality, regardless of how stupid it is. Combine this with the fact that he has no trouble believing basically anything he hears, and you have a character who's borderline broken from their conception. However, it's this very lack of discrimination and skepticism in deciding what to believe that render his powers useless. To understand why this is, let's connect that silly phrase I mentioned earlier to what we know about plot coherence. To craft a satisfying story, it helps to see or hear about something far in advance before that thing actually happens. If Jake wants the thing he believes in to be slightly less fake, he needs to pick that thing specifically and mention it early, singling it out so that the reader notices. Otherwise, it wouldn't make sense or feel satisfying if that thing were to happen later. This is why, from a meta standpoint, believing in something makes it slightly less fake. The more the characters talk about something, the higher the chance that said thing will actually show up later as something important, because that's what leads to a story feeling satisfying. This is why Jake has so much potential as a page, but at the same time has so much work to do. I believe he has the power to literally steer the story in any direction he wants, but he needs to have a clear direction in mind well in advance in order to do so. But don't take this explanation as me playing my entire hand on this metafiction argument alone. Homestuck itself has intricate systems in place to make sure that believing in something makes it slightly less fake. It's true in real life that a general attitude about something will affect the actions you take and the way things turn out in the future. But in Homestuck, it's often the case that, through time shenanigans, this general attitude will also affect the past and present. We see this happen over and over again throughout the story. The idea of a self-fulfilling prophecy. The notion that general ideas and attitudes will influence future events and end up making those ideas a retroactive reality. In this way, the meta of Homestuck is in total synchronicity with the systems it goes to the trouble of establishing. This concept, believing in something to make it slightly less fake, is at the very heart of not just the hope aspect, but Homestuck as a story. This stupid phrase that is currently flashing obnoxiously on the screen is going to be the key to answering the ultimate riddle. I am believing this right now so that it might be slightly less fake when I actually get around to writing part 3. And, more to the point, this phrase with one word taken out very accurately describes what Jake's powers as a Page of Hope are. Jake doesn't just make things slightly less fake by believing in them, he makes them regular less fake. In this sense, his powers are just an amplified version of the same powers that everyone else has. This is probably triggering some doubt in a lot of people right now. How could Jake's powers be the same as everyone else's? Can other characters bring imaginary friends into reality out of nowhere? Probably not. But I wouldn't be surprised if most of them could do so to a much lesser extent. In fact, we might even have an example of this happening. Just look at Tavros. Believing in Rufio didn't exactly make him appear out of nowhere, but fast forward a few thousand pages and we suddenly have a character with the same name who's everything Tavros had envisioned. Is this the author having some fun with callbacks? Yes. Is it only this? Absolutely not. Remember how adventures work after all. You see something, and you say to yourself, this is probably going to be important later on. And then you wait a while, and you learn how you were right, and it feels pretty good. Remember, we're dealing with a story and magic system which makes no distinction between platonic forms and physical objects. Remember, believing in something makes it slightly less fake. It's easy to overlook that as an old man in the pre-Scratch universe, Jake is responsible for initiating the entire story. Without him sailing to the Frog Island and converting the code from the ruins into Spurb, we wouldn't have a story called Homestuck. He even has the good nature to strategically place himself throughout the first 4 acts in ways which make this fact feel calculated and logical. It's also worth noting how essential Jake was towards the Scratch not feeling like a total asspull. If he wasn't inserted into that Bunny's chronology along with that note to John, the Scratch thousands of pages later would have seemed like something that was made up on the spot. Pretty much everything Jake does involves making aspects of the story feel less contrived, and while you could probably argue that this is true for pretty much every other major character, it feels like Jake was uniquely designed to have as much potential for resolving plot threads as possible. He was responsible for the disappearing pumpkins as well as completing the bunny loop. Everything from his name to his shirt to his computers to his intense interest in skulls screams at us that this kid is somehow integrally connected to Lord English, and that by watching him we'll finally understand the bigger picture. Whether this actually happens or it doesn't, we know from the very first page that the potential is there. If you are going to remember one single thing from part 2 of this series, it is imperative that you remember that believing in something makes it slightly less fake. This is why the hope aspect is portrayed as such a powerful force. We see both Jake and Aridin channel this aspect as raw energy, more powerful than Solix's I-beams or Rose's lights or Jade's green sun powers, because what's being channeled here isn't any pre-established system within Homestuck's lore. What's being channeled here is the very energy which converts thoughts into solid objects and instances out of classes. It's the lifeblood which Skaya as a wellspring of unlimited creative potential, Paradox Space as a blank canvas where ideas and forms define reality, and Homestuck itself as a story about kids and houses on the internet are all fundamentally built on.